Good afternoon. My name is Shireen John and I work in the communications team with London International Development Centre. I'm just going to say a few words about the event today and about LIDC for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We are a membership organisation, and I'm pleased to say that both of our speakers today, our speaker and our chair, are both from LIDC organisations. We have a number of higher education institutions and a number of NGOs who work together across disciplines to tackle seemingly intractable problems in the global development landscape. So if you are in a membership organisation of LIDC, then membership is free to you. So please sign up via our website, which you will know because you went there to get information about this event today. And even if you're not in a membership organisation, you can still sign up. Again, please go to our website to check out how to do that. We do a number of events, such as this one, obviously, and we have one next week, which is on planning and informal settlements. We know that we live in a very unequal world right now, and what we're trying to do is to make the world less unequal, to put it simply, not patronizing you, but just trying to keep it simple. When you go to our website, you will see evidence of what else LIDC does. We work in collaboration with people to platform their work. If you have any research that you want us to promote, if you have any ideas for activities that you want us to do, if you want to do a podcast with us, write a blog, take advantage of our training expertise, let us know. We are encouraging people today to live tweet. We are, as you know, at LIDC_UK. Please do that and let us know what you think of the event. And of course, please join LIDC, as I've said before. So what I'm going to do next is hand you over to Jonathan Farr from WaterAid UK. And he will be moderating today's event. Thank you very much, Dr. Albert, for joining us from a different time zone. If you have questions for our speakers or even for us at LIDC, please do go ahead and put them in the Q&A. You're welcome to use the chat, but it's really helpful if you put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, because we'll be looking at the Q&A. So a few words about Jonathan Farr. He's a senior policy analyst for climate change in WaterAid's global policy team. He works on boosting finance for climate adaptation, long-term threats to water security, and community resilience. Prior to joining WaterAid, Jonathan was first Secretary for Climate Change at the British Embassy in Beijing, working on emissions trading, clean transport, and the low carbon economy. So as you see, we only attract the best experts. Jonathan has also covered climate science, nuclear energy, renewable energy briefs, as press spokesman for the UK Department for Energy and Climate Change. And he has also worked in external communications for the Foreign Office, Department for International Trade, and the Downing Street Press Office. So we're very grateful that Jonathan has made time to join us today. He will, of course, know more about the topic than I do. So with no further ado, and if you want some more ado, as I said, go over to our website. I am going to hand you over to Jonathan Farr. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shireen. And thanks everyone for joining today. Welcome. Shireen's stolen all my best lines, but first of all, I wanted to thank her and Gun for organising this event, and for the LIDC for organising this event, but also for all their good work and raising awareness around these issues. And just to give a very brief introduction before we hand over to Michael. I've been working on climate change since about 2007, and despite obvious frustration and justified frustration and doom sometimes about the progress that is being made, there is progress being made, certainly as I've seen it over the last sort of decade or so. But that does ask the question, yes, progress is made, but who is the progress for and who's benefiting from that? Working at WaterAid, we work with communities that are very poor and lack even basic access to water, sanitation, and hygiene, the sort of most fundamental services for for health and for nutrition and so forth. And so these communities are very much on the front line of climate impacts, and you also have the least ability to sort of respond to them and to bounce back from many sort of disasters that happen. And whilst you'd imagine that they would be first in the queue for any sort of international assistance and help, sadly that's not the case. And so there is a sort of, there's definitely climate change is a concern for the entire world, but there's definitely the way it's being responded to, there's inequalities built into that. And so I'm really pleased and looking forward to hearing from Dr. Michael Albert today. He is a lecturer in international relations at the School for Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. And I'm looking forward to hearing him talk about the convergence of these various these crises and global challenges, and what those issues mean for us going forward. So without talking any longer than that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Albert. And once he's finished speaking, then I'll either invite you to ask one of your questions, or ask one of your questions on your behalf, and he'll be happy to answer them, I hope. So over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, John, for that great introduction. Thank you, Goon, again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me share my screen, and then I'll go ahead with my presentation. Okay, so my talk today called Energy Futures and Just Transitions. And so I'll talk a bit in just a sec about my kind of basically my broad research, and then kind of how this talk fits into that. But it'll to some extent be dealing with work in progress, some stuff that I'm currently thinking through for my current book project. And so, yeah, I look forward to hearing questions and feedback from all of you in the audience today. And so to start with kind of just some broad background on the kind of work that I do. So I'm interested in the future and possible futures. And so this involves, looking at this kind of whole sort of cone of possibility that's pictured here on the left, which includes kind of the most probable futures, where we as a planet, looking at kind of integrated human and Earth systems, like where are we most likely headed given current trends. The possible, on the other hand, wider range of possible futures that may unfold through a range of potential tipping points and contingencies. So things that could happen, but that aren't necessarily the most likely following our current trajectory. But then, of course, there's the desirable, or what I like to call the concrete utopian, which I like this quote from the sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein here, who says it's about investigating not the face of the perfect future, but the face of alternative, credibly better, and historically possible, but far from certain futures. And so this is a species of the possible. But the kind of futures that we want to bring into being, to bring a better, more egalitarian, more sustainable world, to think about what would the shape of that look like, how might it actually emerge. So not just trying to create idealized visions of what we want, but a vision of a concrete utopia, something plausible, that would be imperfect, contain its own struggles, its own imperfections, but would be a better world than what we have today. And so basically my research, it's motivated by this argument that there's not enough systematic thinking about the future, especially from a kind of critical social science perspective. Corporations, national security agencies are all engaged in this sort of future anticipation, mapping possible futures. And so I think critical social scientists, those with an interest in more egalitarian, emancipatory futures, should be doing this kind of future analysis as well. And so that brings me kind of more to the subject of today's talk about energy futures. And so kind of a subset a subset of this broader question about possible futures. To think about kind of the broad space of possible futures, you need to bring in many different dimensions or variables across the domains of political economy, technology, security, ecology, identity. But today we're talking mostly about what we can kind of call the political economy, climate, energy nexus. So still a pretty broad nexus, but not the broadest kind of scope of analysis that we might take when thinking about possible futures. And so to say a bit more about what I try to do when I think about when I try and work out possible futures. And so I do this by trying to bring together more quantitative modeling approaches with more qualitative methodologies informed by critical political ecology or critical political economy. So the main way in which energy futures are analyzed among both institutions as well as climate and energy researchers is using what's called integrated assessment models. So these are very complex quantitative models that integrate climate, energy, economic, land use, and other variables, basically quantifying the relationships, the feedbacks between these different systems, and then projecting different possible scenarios that follow different kinds of assumptions or different kinds of, what if contingencies. What if the world is to meet net zero emissions by 2050? What would need to occur for that to happen? What if there is major technological breakthroughs? How might that change the possibility space? Or what if technological innovation remains incremental? So you can kind of shift the parameters and then project out different possible futures. And so this is the main way in which most thinking about energy futures is done in the literature. And so the International Energy Agency, for example, so the IEA, it's one of the most prominent institutions that does this sort of work. And I've included a couple of graphs here from a recent IEA report. And so this one on the right, this is from its net zero report, where it kind of develops a very detailed scenario on how the world economy could reach net zero emissions by 2050. And it gives very detailed pathways for the transformations in technology, in energy use, in demand patterns that would unfold across all these different sectors, including buildings, transport, industry, electricity and heat, and other sources. And so as you can see in this graph, gives very detailed timeline in terms of how emissions would decline over that period. And then it kind of lists all these different milestones. So like in the blue for electricity, looking at the electricity sector, it says to meet this pathway as of 2021, as of last year, no new unabated coal plants should be approved for development, as well as no new oil and gas fields approved for development. Of course, that ship has already sailed, unfortunately. It's 2022 and such things are still being approved. And then you can see it kind of lists different milestones, reaching overall net zero emissions electricity in advanced economies by 2035 and net zero emissions electricity globally by 2040. But that's just focusing on the power sector. And then as you can see, this chart in the bottom left kind of shows some of the different scenarios developed by the International Energy Agency. So on the right, this is the net zero scenario. So the NZE in the green, the one that involves reaching net zero emissions by 2050. But then it gives three other scenarios here. The steps, that's the stated policies scenario. So what happens if basically no new policies are adopted? The current climate and energy policies adopted by governments just kind of continue. What effect would that have on emissions? And so here, emissions would more or less continue to plateau. And this would set us up for an estimated 2.7, possibly more degrees by the end of the century. The announced pledges scenarios, the APS, that refers to, many states like China, even the US, have announced net zero pledges. So this aspiration to reach net zero by 2050. I mean, China has claimed it will reach net zero by 2060, India by 2070, but these are just pledges. In a way, it's rhetoric. It's not embedded in actual policies yet. So the APS, that kind of refers to what if countries follow through on their pledges. And then the SDS, that's a kind of a 2-degree compatible scenario, not quite as dramatic of a decarbonization trajectory as the NZE, the net zero by 2050, but still this would be a dramatic, also a dramatic change in the policy trajectory, putting us more on pace to meet the 2-degree target, but probably not the 1.5-degree target, which the IPCC says if we're going to meet 1.5 degrees, we need net zero by 2050. So this is the kind of work that the International Energy Agency does. Also the IPCC in its reports, it projects out these different scenarios. You know, what would be a 1.5-degree compatible scenario? What would be a 2-degree compatible scenario, et cetera, et cetera. But this kind of work, it tends to, you know, I mean, almost always, just because of the nature of the modeling enterprise, it's not able to integrate factors like power relations, what kinds of transformations in the political economy would this involve? What sort of political struggles would be necessary to drive these transformations? And also, would these necessarily be just or unjust transitions? And so none of this information gets included in these kind of quantitative modeling exercises. And I mean, it's just the nature of the exercise that these kinds of qualitative political factors are, you know, that can't really be quantified. They get left out of the picture. And so that's why in my work, I argue that we need to bring in approaches from critical political ecology or political economy. And so this basically refers to the study of how power relations and political economic structures shape human environment relations and shape environmental outcomes. How do they drive, you know, environmental crises like the climate crisis, for example? How is this the product of power and inequality? And so the aim here of this kind of approach is to deepen our understanding of not just the technical and economic parameters of the energy transition, but deepening our understanding of the political dynamics of energy transitions and how they might unfold. And so rather than abstracting from power relations, from political struggles, from culture, we need to bring these two frames together. And so that's what I try to do. And that's definitely, it's challenging in practice. It's a work in progress for me, but there is a kind of an emerging body of transdisciplinary futures research that tries to bring together the qualitative and the quantitative in this way. And this, you know, so you can draw on these modeling scenarios, but also combine them with kind of more qualitative political economic analysis. But at the end of the day, it inherently involves degrees of intuition or speculation and thinking about how the future might unfold. You know, there's no airtight, you know, absolutely rigorous methodology that one could use that would do away with, you know, speculation or intuition. Okay, so that's kind of a broad sense of kind of what I try to do in my work. And so, and today in particular, we're thinking specifically about energy futures and kind of possible ways forward for the energy transition. How might it unfold? And so to explore this kind of question, we need to take into account several variables. I mean, you know, at the limit, one could bring into account a potentially infinite number of variables to consider, but obviously we have to simplify things. And so to simplify things, I'm focusing here on 3 key variables, and each one that can unfold in different ways. And then the different set of futures that we can imagine would involve different combinations of these different variables. So I'll explain later more what I mean by that. But so let's start by thinking like, what are some of the broad variables we need to think about? So first, state policies and investment patterns. So I mean, like I was saying in the previous slide, the IEA and others, they project, you know, what if state policies more or less remain the same, unchanged, but what if they intensify? What if states adopt more ambitious climate policies, like, increased carbon pricing, coordinated carbon pricing between states, or increased spending on renewable energy research and development, or, increased climate finance, especially for the global South. How might these policy changes change the decarbonization trajectory, and how would they reshape investment patterns? Because remember, even though the transition is to a large extent driven by private capital investment, these patterns of investment are to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent shaped by state policies. And so it's going to require transformations in policy in order to increase private investment to the extent that's needed to drive the transition. The IEA estimates that investment's got to triple from current levels in renewable energy if we're gonna be on pace to meet the Paris targets. So that's one question in terms of the future. How will policies evolve? A second key variable, we can identify technological innovation. And so this is inherently, all these variables are connected, because this is also directly connected with the question about state policies, because state policies also drive technological innovation, and vice versa. Technological innovation, for example, cheapening costs of renewable energy, battery systems, can also have a positive effect on state policies, driving states to take on more ambitious climate policies, like phasing out internal combustion engines, phasing out coal, for example, when, as these low carbon technologies become more competitive. So the two are connected, but with technological innovation, we can ask, will innovation remain kind of incremental? Will it mostly involve incremental improvements on existing technologies? So like existing silicon-based solar panels and lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicle designs, and current generations of biofuels, for example? Or will we encounter revolutionary breakthroughs that cannot fully be expected in advance? And so this is important because the energy transition, especially according to IEA projections, it's going to require breakthroughs, and it's going to require technologies that are not yet in existence. And so especially for things like carbon capture, green hydrogen, producing steel, aluminum, concrete through green sources. So these are considered kind of hard to abate sectors. Also oceanic shipping and aviation, flying. These are all very difficult to decarbonize sectors that are going to require technological breakthroughs. So at least according to the IEA, and again, this from a different perspective, they would say, we could live differently. We could change the structure of the political economy. We don't necessarily have to rely on these breakthroughs, but if we're going to continue to live as we do today, have similar to today demand for flying, for example, and steel and aluminum concrete production, then we're gonna have to find breakthroughs in these areas. So the technology innovation variable you can project different futures, one based on incremental innovation, one based on revolutionary innovation. But then the actual future will likely involve somewhere in between. And so, but this is why when projecting futures, we necessarily need to simplify things, but likely we'll get some revolutionary breakthroughs that can't be expected and incremental innovations in others. So then a third variable is political struggles over renewable energy. And here, this involves kind of the wide gamut of renewable energy systems across their life cycle. And so this includes from mining, from mining the raw materials that are critical to renewable energy systems, things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earth metals, and then to manufacturing. And so this involves, kind of struggles over labor in terms of, working conditions, working class struggles in, at the kind of the scale of the factories that are producing the key components that then are part of these renewable energy systems. Land use, so how are these renewable energy systems, how are they sited? What kinds of conflicts might that raise with local communities? Ownership, so who owns the infrastructure, who benefits financially in terms of relations of ownership, and possibly achieving rents through owning electricity generation infrastructures. And then also end of life disposal in terms of how at the end of their lifespan, how are these technologies, how are they disposed of, and who is affected by that. And so all of these questions they raise this question of not simply how fast will the energy transition unfold. Of course, this question of how fast, it's very important, and political struggles will of course be critical to shaping how fast will this transition unfold, in terms of pushing state policies to accelerate the transition. But then the question's also broader than that, because it's about how will the transition unfold? Not simply how fast will it unfold, but how will this be done? So will this be done by mitigating inequalities, redressing historic forms of injustice, empowering workers and marginalized communities? Or would the transition, even if it accelerates and meets the Paris targets, might it still entrench or even intensify existing forms of inequality and injustice that are endemic to contemporary capitalism? So that's mostly what I mean by this parameter. Will it simply lead to a kind of a world, a decarbonized world that entrenches current power relations or that challenges them? And so a final point here before I move on, and this kind of adds another level of complexity to thinking about energy futures and to thinking about futures more broadly, is that these futures will be global, uneven, and combined. And so in other words, different states, different regions have their own transitions, their own, we would say, relatively autonomous transitions that are shaped by local struggles, local capacities, local priorities. But at the same time, all states, all regions are connected, are inseparable from each other through dense webs of interdependence shaped by geopolitics, trade, ecological relations, and unequal power relations. And so in this sense, it's possible, I think, to speak of a global energy transition because all these states are kind of moving together in a similar direction, and it creates this process that's more than the sum of its parts. So we can speak of a global energy transition, but at the same time, the transitions are also inherently local, shaped by local and regional priorities and capacities. And so I come from an international relations background, and so I tend to focus more on kind of the global scale dimensions of the transition, whereas other scholars in other fields may, zoom in more, focus more on local struggles in a particular locality, for example. And so I think, both of these kinds of work, looking at kind of big picture scale as well as more local scale, both of them are vital, and we can't do without both these things. But my approach tends to focus more on the global scale. And so you're inevitably going to miss out on important details when you do that, but then it can also help give a sense of kind of the big picture and where the planet as a whole may be headed. Okay, so those are kind of the key variables. I mean, just kind of simplifying things in terms of how we think about energy futures. But now let's think about how we might combine some of these variables to produce different scenarios. And so here I've created a simplified slice of the possibility space. And I do this by creating what's called a 2x2 axis of uncertainty chart. So this is a very common technique used in futures analysis, where basically you have two axes. So in this case, we have technology on the X or horizontal axis, and then we have policy on the Y or vertical axis. And so by combining different possible trajectories for each variable, we can then create a different set of scenarios. And so here I'm just focusing on the first two. And so in a bit, then I'll bring in the kind of the political struggles variable. But we're going to start here just by combining these first two, because it's too much. It's impossible to do this kind of analysis if you bring in more than two. So we're starting here at two. So what would happen if we have a world in which current policies more or less continue? So the steps scenario talked about by the IEA, or perhaps, moderate incremental improvements, but no major dramatic shift in climate policies. And then so we have that in addition to incremental innovation. So basically just incremental improvements on existing technologies rather than any kind of more dramatic breakthroughs that really bring down costs and allow us to really harness renewable energy in a more kind of expansive way. So my argument, and I will acknowledge here, I don't have time to get into all the nuances of these scenarios in terms of why these futures would unfold in these ways, but I'll try and explain it as succinctly as I can. And if you're interested, please ask in the Q&A if you'd like me to elaborate on kind of these futures and kind of why I make these arguments. So starting with this scenario 1, combining current policies and incremental innovation. This would create a world in which the transition, it's too slow to meet the Paris targets. Fossil fuel demand, it keeps rising into the 2030s, so well beyond what we should be doing. This would mean that an unprecedented energy depletion crisis is possible. So something similar to the kind of energy crisis that we're experiencing today as a result of the combined recovery from the pandemic, as well as the Ukraine crisis and kind of the cutting off oil and gas from Russia. We were already to some extent in an energy crisis, and now this has been exacerbated. And so my argument for why this might happen in the 2030s, it's a bit complicated, but the basic idea is that if in this scenario, fossil fuel demand, it would continue to increase. And at the same time, the world would become more and more reliant on these very unconventional, difficult to access oil reserves, like in the Arctic, fracking, unconventional sources, offshore oil, much more energy intensive, more difficult to extract. And at this, at the same time, demand would be going up. And at the same time, as we're kind of seeing to some extent today, investors are very hesitant about investing in new oil and gas fields. There's kind of this, there's a lot of ambiguity among investors where, they're thinking, well, like if states are going to take their climate pledges seriously, then we shouldn't be investing in new oil and gas. And so this could potentially, if the world does indeed continue to increase fossil fuel demand, this could lead to an even worse energy crisis down the road. So that's kind of the basic argument that I give here. But even if this doesn't happen, even if there isn't an energy crisis, it would certainly at least set us up for long-term climate catastrophe. And so following the STEPS scenario, as well as kind of current policies projections, we would probably reach around 3 degrees by the end of the century. And that would potentially be very catastrophic, at least for most of the world. Scenario 2, on the other hand, what if we have a decisive policy shift in combination with incremental innovation? So a decisive policy shift, as I mentioned earlier, this could take different forms. And so it could take the form of more globally coordinated carbon pricing, for example, among the major economies. So like the US, Europe, China, adopting some kind of globally coordinated carbon pricing, putting carbon border adjustment tariffs on other states who are not adopting similar policies. So basically, penalizing their exports to try and push them to decarbonize. Could also involve, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. This is one of the key kind of no-brainer policy shifts that needs to happen to accelerate the transition. Also, tripling green energy investment. As I said, that's what the International Energy Agency recommends to put us on track for the Paris target. So what if we do have a decisive policy shift in this way, but we also still only have incremental innovation? Again, my argument a bit complicated here, but the basic scenario here is that the transition would temporarily accelerate, but then because there would be limited innovation, this would lead to rising energy, food, and mineral costs. And so some of you may have encountered this term greenflation. This term has kind of been circulating a bit in the media over the past year, as kind of connected with the energy crisis and rising mineral prices, as demand for things like lithium and copper and other metals that are seen as necessary to the transition, it raises prices. So this is kind of considered greenflation. And so I argue that we're likely to face potentially even worse greenflation in the case of an accelerated energy transition, especially if there's no major breakthroughs that are able to kind of bring down costs across the global economy. And so then this could lead to economic stagnation and then likely a right-wing populist backlash. And again, this is something, we're seeing this to some extent today, but I argue that, today kind of gives us a taste of what we might see in the future if climate policies accelerate. And I should acknowledge, this is a contested argument because some see renewable energy as it getting increasingly cheaper and cheaper, that it's ultimately going to have a savings effect. It's going to be cheaper to make this transition. But I could explain more in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But the main point here is that I think a strong case can be made that costs, there will likely be long-term savings, but in the short term, costs will likely go up. There will likely be at least inflation in the short term, which will create the risk of this kind of stagnation and populist backlash. So now shifting to the third scenario. So what if we combine the decisive policy shift with revolutionary technological innovation? And so in a way, this could sort of be considered kind of a best case green capitalist scenario. And so in this scenario, there'd be what's called a technology policy feedback that emerges, which drives rapid innovation, brings down costs, accelerates the transition, and brings the Paris targets within reach. But this does not necessarily create a just transition. So it's possible to accelerate decarbonization in a way, but it would not necessarily create a just transition. And I'll turn to that point in a moment. And then just very briefly, point 4, this was a future in which we combine current policies or incremental policies with revolutionary innovation. And this is kind of a bit of an interesting wild card scenario here. And so and there's different ways. And so, but the basic shape of this scenario would be that current policies are sufficient. So we wouldn't need this kind of decisive, dramatic policy shift. Current policies could be sufficient to drive major breakthroughs across these different areas. So like improved solar energy efficiency, breakthroughs in green hydrogen and green steel, aluminum, new approaches to aviation and shipping that are able to decarbonize them, these kind of breakthroughs. But they would likely unfold more gradually. Because again, my assumption here is that state policies are needed to accelerate innovation in these areas. And so it could still unfold more gradually, but it's less likely to occur without these decisive policies. And now this scenario, as a result, since it would unfold more gradually, it would also be less likely to meet the Paris targets and even less likely to ensure a just transition, because that would certainly require decisive state policies to shape the transition in a more just manner. And if it doesn't do that, then this could also lead to populist backlash. So, whether or not that scenario would be stable, that's kind of open to question. Maybe, but maybe not. Okay, so now let's move on by kind of bringing in political struggles to shape the energy transition. And so I'm going to start here with domestic politics. So I'm going to first talk about some of the kind of key challenges for domestic politics and kind of creating a just transition at the scale of a single nation states. And then I'll talk about kind of some of the global dimensions and how what would be the challenges in creating a just transition at the global scale. And so here, so there's a few key challenges. And so this is by no means exhaustive, but just to talk about some of the key challenges here. And basically, again, the issue here is not so much how fast the transition happens, but how it is done and how it is shaped by political struggles for a just transition. So whether we get kind of a more unjust or just transition. So first, one of the key issues, and this is kind of the most commonly discussed aspect of a just transition, which is to protect displaced fossil fuel and other industrial workers. So I'm not going to go into depth on this point. This is, the most commonly discussed aspect of, what would it mean to enact a just transition. But we should note here something that's less often discussed is that if we have a revolutionary technology scenario, then it's going to be more difficult to protect displaced fossil fuel workers, because we would also then be living in a world of increased automation through artificial intelligence and robotics that could potentially significantly increase technological unemployment through this increase in automation. So this is an issue that's rarely discussed by proponents of a just transition. They assume that the transition will create millions of jobs. It'll be a job creator, it'll create much more than what is displaced by lost jobs in the fossil fuel industry. And that's potentially true, but when you bring in automation into the picture, things get more complicated, because solar and wind manufacturing and installation, these things can also be automated to some extent. So especially in a revolutionary innovation scenario, this would be a more difficult challenge, potentially less of a challenge in a more incremental innovation trajectory. So the second key challenge, maintaining energy affordability or preventing a cost of living crisis. So of course, this is very relevant for us all today in the UK and Europe and basically most of the world, where inflation is a major shock, especially bad in parts of the global south where food prices are rising significantly, energy prices across the board, metal prices, other commodities. And so there's a major risk that the energy transition could also have a similar effect. And so as I said in the previous slide, this could be because of this phenomena that is called greenflation, or the fact that the renewable energy transition, it has very high upfront financial, energy, and mineral demands. And so it's going to increase demand for all these things in the early phases, which means it's probably going to push up prices. It will likely eventually push down prices, but the challenge is that this could create something like a cost of living crisis, or at least some form of greenflation in the near term that would affect marginalized communities, poor populations most. And so there's a question of struggling to basically force states to enact more redistributive policies to protect populations from these potential inflationary pressures, rather than kind of putting the burden on poor populations. So that will be another kind of area of struggle. And then third, and then this is another kind of complex area, is basically, and so this involves two things here, and kind of which are related but different. And so one, overcoming resistance to solar and wind energy projects while also preventing green accumulation by dispossession. And so this concept, basically this riffs on a concept from David Harvey, the well-known Marxist political economist, but basically preventing forms of basically renewable energy, reinforcing forms of dispossessing communities, displacing them to build solar and wind farms, transmission lines, new mines for renewable energy metals, etc. And so in this chart in the top right here, it's a bit hard to read, but this gives a sense of the land use demands. And so the kind of the dark blue points, it kind of represents how much, like, estimated how much land cover would solar energy require to shift to a 100% solar energy world. And so you can see for European countries, most of these are European countries on the left, would have very high land use demands, between 30 to sometimes even over 100%. And we should know these are definitely overestimates. They're based on simplified assumptions, but it gives us kind of a sense. Basically, the key point here is that solar energy, wind energy systems are very land intensive. They require a lot of land. And so as you can see in this New York Times headline, as demand for this green energy grows, it's going to take up more and more land use. And this is already generating intense resistance. And so sometimes this takes the form of right-wing populist resistance, especially against wind farms in Europe. Also, there's major right-wing resistance against solar developments in the United States currently. But then it can also fuel this kind of green accumulation by dispossession. And so there have been many documented cases of this, especially in Mexico, in India, in North Africa, and I'm sure this is happening all over the world, where basically communities are not properly consulted. They do not offer their consent, but renewable energy developers in partnership with states kind of come in, build these large projects without the consent of local communities, sometimes pushing them off land and without bringing enough local benefits. And so this is kind of a major tendency that we see. And so overall, the implications for energy futures is that failure to enact a just transition could either fuel populist backlash or lead to a green authoritarian decarbonized dystopia. So this kind of idea of a decarbonized dystopia, this is a term that I take from Peter Newell and Matthew Patterson in their book, Climate Capitalism. So the idea here is that if these just transition policies, like to protect populations from rising energy prices, to protect displaced workers, and to consult local communities rather than just kind of trying to force these renewable energy projects upon them, that if these things are not done, then this will likely trigger a populist backlash. And that could either then slow the transition, stymie the transition, or it can lead to kind of authoritarian state power to just kind of force it through to impose these changes in this kind of green authoritarian way. So those are two ways of kind of thinking about the implications of these challenges. So now let's talk briefly about kind of the global challenges. And so there's a lot of things we could talk about in this context, but I'm going to talk mostly about whether the transition challenges or deepens relations of imperialism in the world economy. So by imperialism in this context, I mean relations of uneven exchange, or ecologically unequal exchange is a concept, a useful concept that is often used, in which some regions, and so mostly, but not always, the high income, rich countries in the global north, where they disproportionately benefit from flows of embodied labor, land, and resources extracted elsewhere. And so typically, but not always, from the global south. And so this is depicted in this chart here. And so this chart, it's a bit complex. We don't have time to get into the nuances, but the key point is that the high income countries are represented in the purple, whereas everyone else, like the upper middle income, is in light blue. China is represented in the red, India in the yellow, the lower middle income in the blue. And so basically what this graph shows is that the high income countries, so like North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, they overwhelmingly are net appropriators of embodied raw materials, energy and land and labor from the rest of the world. So they disproportionately, even though they involve a very small, relatively small percentage of the world's population, they disproportionately control or benefit from these forms of extraction across the world system. And so basically extracting embodied land, labor, and resources from the global south and benefiting as a result. And so they also profit from these transactions. And so in a sense, because imports from the global south for high income countries, they're much cheaper because labor is remunerated at vastly lower levels, in some cases 28 times lower in low income countries compared to high income countries. So it's much cheaper for high income countries to basically appropriate these resources, where it's much more expensive relatively for low income countries to purchase these exports from the global north. And so from a critical political economy perspective, this is not because the global north is more productive or more efficient, but simply it's because of geopolitically unequal power relations shaped by histories of colonialism. And so basically this shows that rich countries have a disproportionate stranglehold on the majority of the Earth's resources, primarily benefiting from their extraction, while the costs of this extraction fall hardest on marginalized communities in both the global north and the global south. And so the implications of this. So this brings us to this question: how might the renewable energy transition reinforce these relations of imperialism or ecologically unequal exchange? And so there's a few forms here, possible forms of what we could call renewable energy imperialism. So first, in the realm of mining for the renewable energy transition, which risks dramatically increasing what is often called green sacrifice zones across the world economy, and so especially in the global south. So as this chart here on the right, the top right from the IEA, it shows that compared to 2020, in order to meet in the sustainable development scenario, mineral demand for lithium would need to increase 42 times above contemporary levels, 25 times above contemporary levels for graphite, 21 times for cobalt, and et cetera for nickel and rare earths. So we're looking at dramatic increases in extractivism. And so it's already been amply documented how there have been struggles against the increase of these extractivist projects. So this picture on the bottom left, this is a protest in Chile against lithium mining, which is very water intensive, known to damage local water resources. And so indigenous and other local communities have in certain cases been rising up against these forms of extractivism, in some cases supporting them and just arguing for retaining, for local communities getting more benefit from these projects. And so the way that communities engage with extractivism, it's complex. It's not always flat out resistance, but certainly this is a common tendency. This picture on the right, shows child labor in cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is by far the main supplier of cobalt, something like 60% of world cobalt supplies that are often extracted through very horrific labor conditions. And so these can be considered examples of the way that renewable energy mining can increase, kind of create new forms of imperialism. Second, renewable energy produced in the global south, it may primarily benefit domestic elites and populations and investors in the global north, rather than, for the most part, benefiting local communities. And so some of you may know about the now defunct Desert Tech Initiative, which was basically an envisioned initiative to produce renewable energy across North Africa, mostly Algeria and Morocco, and then have it exported to Europe. And so basically many say, this was kind of a clear case of neo-colonialism, where Europe would be basically extracting the solar resources from these regions. And so that project is in some ways defunct, but it's also being revitalized by this idea now that these regions, especially regions in North Africa and Chile and Saudi Arabia that are rich in solar resources, that they can become producers of green hydrogen, basically using their abundant solar energy to produce hydrogen, which is an energy carrier that can potentially be a useful way to decarbonize hard to abate sectors like aviation, shipping, producing steel and concrete through low carbon methods. And so now the idea is that these areas can become green hydrogen exporters to the rich countries of the global north. And so depending on how this unfolds, this could also become a kind of a new form of imperialism. And then finally, this idea of e-waste and the fact that solar and wind energy at the end of their lifetime, they become waste, and the burden of waste flows tends to disproportionately impact communities in the global south. And so this could also intensify this e-waste crisis. And so what are the implications of this? That it's possible that we could envision a domestic just transition. So it's possible to envision, say, a just transition in the context of Europe or the United States, where, say, domestic populations are protected, the burdens of the transition are equitably shared, but at the same time, these burdens are being pushed disproportionately onto the global south, marginalized communities especially. They do not benefit and are, suffer more harm as a result. And so in this sense, a domestic just transition is not sufficient. We also need to think about global just transition. So now let me summarize by talking about, so what are some of the key scenarios then, and kind of trying to kind of bring what we've covered together, because I've covered a lot of ground here. And so I'll connect this back with the IEA scenarios discussed earlier. And so again, these scenarios are by no means exhaustive, but hopefully kind of a useful way to get a sense of the possibility space. So first, scenario one. So this would be a kind of current or incremental policies that brings about climate catastrophe and intensified injustice. So kind of worst case scenario. This would basically be the steps, something like the steps scenario. Two, we could see decisive policy shifts that temporarily accelerate decarbonization, but result in right-wing populist backlash, reversion to fossil fuel growth at all costs. So this would kind of be, we have a temporary acceleration, but because there are not enough policies to kind of deal with, to kind of promote a just transition, this could lead to a backlash, forcing the world economy back towards something like a steps scenario. Third scenario, this is kind of accelerated decarbonization through the technology policy feedback discussed earlier, but one that cements current inequalities, both domestic and global, creating what Matthew Patterson, Peter Newell call a decarbonized dystopia. Fourth, on the other hand, we could have accelerated decarbonization that enacts a domestic just transition while reinforcing global scale processes of imperialism and inequality. So domestic just transition plus a globally unjust transition. And this could have both kind of incremental as well as more revolutionary technology variants. You know, you can imagine a form of it in which technology doesn't change that much, or one in which it does change much. But then 5 would be a truly just transition. And so I'm already over my time, so I'm just kind of very quickly conclude here by talking about, you know, what would a truly just global transition look like? I don't have time to get into the details here, but this would require degrowth in the global north and convergence with the global south towards similar material energy consumption levels, this is kind of what I try to depict in this graph here on the right, basically that higher income countries are massively transgressing planetary boundaries, whereas low income countries are not. So there needs to be a kind of a contraction and convergence towards a more sustainable medium that improves well-being for everyone. And this is going to require, second point, reducing primary extraction of minerals to the largest extent possible. And so energy demand reduction in the global north is vital. Also prioritizing public transit over private cars, things like extended producer responsibility, where basically producers, companies have to deal with the end of life disposal of the products that they sell. And then also there needs to be massive public investments in recycling infrastructure. So third, a key point here is that human needs rather than profit and economic growth should determine how much and how energy is consumed. So rather than simply producing renewable energy for the purposes of continuing growth and accumulation, instead we need to be thinking about how is this energy being used? Is it being used to continue to fuel luxury consumption in the global north, or is it being used to meet critical development needs around the world? And then fourth, finally, energy democracy. Basically the idea that there should be democratic control, participation, and/or accountability over all aspects of renewable energy systems, from generation through mining, manufacturing, siting and installation, and disposal. So rather than these projects being controlled by corporations, private investors, and shareholders and state bureaucrats, instead, there should be much more democratic participation and accountability over shaping these things. And how might this kind of future emerge? That's the challenging question. But I argue that it's certainly not the most likely future, but a combination of very intense cascading crises in the coming decades with increasingly powerful climate justice movements makes it a possibility. And so it's kind of a concrete utopian future that we need to envision, we need to work towards. It's not the most likely thing to happen, but it's one that through struggle, communities who care about climate justice on a global scale, not just domestically, can fight for over time. Okay, I'll stop there. I apologize for going over the time that was expected, but at least we have hopefully some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was really, really interesting, and also slightly horrifying to think that, of course, whilst sort of there's a certain level of doomerism which thinks we never will make it to net zero, even if we were to, it may be that we'll have to face terrifying, horrible choices between who actually benefits from that, and things like environmental authoritarianism, or simply just massive inequality, or alternatively just a lowering, just accepting that living standards will fall for everybody, even though we may have avoided the apocalypse. And that is as a hard lesson to think about, but I think it definitely does need some consideration. And I'm just going to, I picked a couple of questions because we don't have a huge amount of time, but I think these are sort of worth asking. I mean, the first one, which is from Deniz Demirag, apologies, I'm sure I've pronounced your name wrong, was about environmental authoritarianism, and if you can think of any real life examples of where that's kind of playing out, because I think that is, looking at what's happening in China, for example, where theoretically their policies are very good, but obviously they're able to happen because that's sort of central command and control. And I wonder if you had any sort of thoughts around that as my first question.
Yeah, I mean, China's definitely an example. There's also, I mean, this is contested, but there's some evidence that, exploitation of Uyghurs might be involved in producing solar panels and polysilicon, which is a key ingredient in solar panels in the Xinjiang region. And so, basically using forced labor. And so that's to some extent uncertain, but there is at least some evidence that kind of labor exploitation is happening. And then, yeah, it's certainly these kinds of policies that I was mentioning earlier, like green accumulation by dispossession, which there have been examples of that around the world, kind of forcing displacing communities to push through these renewable energy projects, especially I think there's a risk that there's many movements who are saying calling for a climate emergency and declaring a climate emergency to try and kind of ramp up more accelerated decarbonization. And so I think, I'm very sympathetic to these movements, but at the same time, given the kind of history of sort of the way that states can use these kind of state of emergency suspensions of normal democratic norms and procedures, there's a possibility that, they could potentially use that to accelerate decarbonization in a way that just kind of leads to mass displacement, not only to build solar and wind farms, but also to ramp up the extractivism for minerals like lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other things. So yeah, I think that these sorts of things can be seen as maybe precursors to a kind of a future green authoritarianism that might plausibly emerge.
Great. And then I'm going to adapt a question that came through from the prolific anonymous attendee who's posed a lot of questions, which they asked, how do you view the impact of energy transitions policies defined by development countries of the LMICs? But I suppose I would just slightly reframe that and ask, I mean, the need is for, there's all this land and resources, and and water is one of those, of course, but also all the cobalt and so forth we talk about, and they are currently in the hands of least developed countries. So is there an opportunity to sort of, for those countries in the global south and elsewhere, to sort of redefine their place in the hierarchy, I suppose, in the way things are? What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an important question, and I think, Bolivia and Ecuador have kind of done this to some extent through a kind of a resource nationalist strategy. And currently Chile, under the new leftist government, is kind of trying to do a similar thing with kind of basically having more domestic control over their lithium reserves, being able to, sustain more of the benefits, have less of the profits than kind of be extracted by transnational corporations who then kind of, extract these profits and they benefit shareholders who are mostly cited in the global north. And so there is a possibility through these kind of state-based strategies to kind of harness the benefits of these domestic resources more intensely. One of the challenges is that these states are often, to some extent at least, they don't always have kind of the local expertise or technology to extract and exploit these resources in as efficient of a way. And so they often rely on these transnational companies in order to do that. And so I think it's challenging I think it's certainly doable. I'm no expert on kind of how that would happen, but there are efforts within these countries to kind of, build up local expertise, know-how, to become more autonomous, have more control over the resources, less reliant on Western transnational companies to develop and benefit from these resources.
Excellent. I'm mindful that we're slightly over time. I was going to just follow up with one final question, which just to give you your soapbox back for a moment, Michael, which is looking at sort of the progress that is being made. You've done very well looking into sort of the different future scenarios, but what would, in terms of this sort of immediate sort of political trends, what is it that gives you a bit of hope that things might go in the right direction?
Well, I think, certainly the progress in renewable energy and lowering costs is a sign of hope. I mean, I think the wave of recent net zero pledges is, even though it's a lot of rhetoric, it's arguably, what some environmental politics scholars would call bullshit to some extent, in the way that very little substance behind it. But it's at least, I think that there is definitely at least a discursive shift where the net zero target is becoming a new norm within international politics. It's increasingly shaping investment strategies, and it's a tool through which climate activists can hold governments accountable to fulfill those targets, or at least get as close to them as possible. And so I think that's a sign of hope. And then also just to remember that, like, even if we don't hit net zero, even if we exceed 2 degrees, that's not the end of the story. That equitable adaptation is still possible. It's going to be an ongoing struggle, but I think that there can be a tendency for some quarters of the climate movement to think that, oh, if we don't get net zero by 2050, then, we're all doomed and there's nothing more we can do. I think that, every 1/10 of a degree matters, and it's possible to envision equitable adaptation even in a significantly hotter world. And that's, it would certainly be a more challenging world, and we want to avoid that to the greatest extent we can. But, it's still, the struggle for climate justice would still continue.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for listening and for your questions. I didn't throw the floor open because we are pushed for time. And so with that, I'll say once again, thank you to Michael, and pass to Shireen to take us out, if that's all right.
Wow, gosh, thank you. Yeah, really, thank you. Just speaking as an individual who is half Sierra Leonean, half Lebanese, so much of what you said really struck a chord there. And really, it all comes down to, if we want a just world, privileged people have got to give up some of their privileges. They just have to, or else we're contributing towards inequality. So thank you very much for that, on behalf of myself as an individual, but also LIDC for that excellent presentation. And thank you so much, Jonathan Farr, for coming along and moderating today. I want to talk a bit about next week. On the 21st of April, after Easter, we have an event which is dear to my heart. I just mentioned that I grew up, spent most of my life in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which is a classic example of a city where a substantial section of the population now live in horrible informal settlements. A lot of people fled to Freetown because of the brutal civil war that we had. And recently, the City Council's Mayor, Yvonne Akisoya, who you will see on our website, we have done an interview and blogged about. She is working with the Sierra Leone Urban Research Council to take steps to address the formidable challenges that people living in these informal settlements, quote unquote slums, face. On the 21st of April, we have people from the Sierra Leone Urban Research Council in Freetown and the Development and Planning Unit at UCL, which is a member organisation of LIDC, coming to join us to share ideas about what can be done to mitigate the effects of risks faced globally by those living in informal settlements. So we won't just be talking about Freetown. I always talk about Sierra Leone because I'm so passionate about it, but we are talking about these issues that impact on people globally. So please do have a look at our website, and hope to see you then. Thank you so much for joining us. There is a recording being done of today's event. So if you joined us late or want to recap or want to share the presentation today, which I really do hope you will, because it was fantastic, Michael. Honestly, you covered so much and the slides were excellent. I resorted to even taking photographs of some of them because there was so much information that we will want to share and go over. So thank you very much for joining us today. Stay connected with us. Even if you don't want to join LIDC, at least sign up for our newsletter. And thank you, everyone who's here today. All best wishes, and have a great Ramadan, Easter, whatever you mark. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for all the kind words. And sorry I wasn't able to get to all the questions, but yeah, appreciate the kind words. And yeah, hope to stay involved in the future.
Well, they were true words. Thank you. Bye-bye.